Hello, welcome to this presentation on concept mapping. I'm Dr. John Pelley. I work here at the Texas Tech University School of Medicine. And what we're going to do here for this next approximately an hour, maybe a little longer, is to teach you about concept mapping, and this will constitute one of the three components of our expert skills program pre-matriculation phase. At Texas Tech, we're going to have some other phases that will follow this, but this is a part of the program that can be used at any medical school, and in fact is very applicable to residents. Or even, I even have had physician faculty who are studying for subspecialty boards adopt concept mapping as a method for studying. So what I want to start with today is to set kind of the tone, kind of the stage or state of mind, is an excerpt, a quote by Dr. Willis Hurst, who is a well-known cardiologist who has recently deceased, but a very well-known cardiologist at the Emory School of Medicine, who made the point in one of his articles, in one of his writings, that we should focus as teachers of students on helping students understand they need to educate themselves. The one thing that he doesn't say in that first quote that I have here is how that happens. However, I read through the article a little further and was able to pull out just that short piece at the bottom that points out that students do this by learning how to learn. Now, I know that sounds like counterintuitive, but we'll explain this. What students tend to learn in pre-med is how to memorize, but they don't learn how to reason. And in medical school, we demand more because of the nature of the job. So this is where we're going to take you and help you learn how to do that for yourselves, following simple rules with an understanding of what your objective is, and I believe you're going to find that this is something you'll want to adopt. So here is a look at how we're going to conduct all this. I'm going to first just give a brief introduction to define what a concept map is in case some of you haven't heard of this before. Many students actually have heard of it before. An instructor has used it in their course or in some other fashion. They've seen it in an article or something like that. Or maybe just figured it out for themselves and started using it. But we'll go through different ways of looking at concept mapping and to give you a perspective of the different functions that it serves. We'll then take a look at an actual concept map, one that was in fact published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, or in fact we'll have actually several out of that article. And then we're going to get right down to work and show how to construct them. I have a reason actually for putting this early, and that is one of the learning styles that I'm going to describe later in this talk much prefers to be shown right away how something is used. They like the practical aspect of knowledge. So I'm going to satisfy that for people. Now, I'm going to follow the construction of a map and reinforce that with examples. And the examples will give me a chance to comment further on the subtleties of maps and things to think about when you're constructing your maps. I will then talk about something that's been of great concern to me as an academic and as a teacher, and that is the the various barriers to utilization of maps. I've come to know that maps are the appropriate and single best method for learning in medical school for every student, and for that matter, for every faculty member. And I'll explain the logic behind that later. But not everybody will adopt it. And I'll talk about what I've learned about that and how we are taking steps to address that and to try and find better and better ways of motivating students to use this method. Finally, I'll conclude with a few slides that will list recommendations and cautions that I have learned over the years, and I'll share some of that with you. Now, at this point, before I go further, I'd like to encourage you to be using not only the study guide, which accompanies this at a separate link on the website, because it will show you what to listen for. And if you can fill out that study guide by maybe pausing the video as you go, I think you'll find it will use your time better because you'll remember more. And then you won't have to keep going back and revisiting the video. And a second thing that's at another link in the same area at the web page is a set of notes that accompany this slide. And these are notes that I've especially printed with notes comments under each slide. And so when printed all together, they make essentially a companion workbook. I can't remember the way I lecture every single thing I want to say because I've done this about 100 times, and I just hit different points harder in different sessions. So by having the workbook, it's sort of a backup for me. Now let's move on into the definition of what concept maps are. I think the most obvious thing you're going to see when we begin looking at the examples of concept maps is that because they're a visual picture that's connected together, they're a way of organizing information. Now, obviously not the only way. One way of organizing information is in a book, a textbook. Another way is in a lecture syllabus or an outline. So concept maps are just an alternative way of organizing information. And for most people, that's actually all they understand about concept mapping. Now, I want to take it further and tell you something I've learned after 25 years of experience with medical students, and now I'm giving you the feedback of what I've learned from those students. And that is that concept mapping is actually a reading method. concept mapping will cause you to read better in the time available than any other method you can find. And believe me, I have looked for anything else. The concept map construction causes you to read in a way that is analytical, it is deep reading, and it requires a lot of decisions to construct the map. All of these make the very best use of your time, and so now you're going to understand a little bit about the choice of titles. Concept mapping as a time management tool. Because of the nature of the way it's done, and I'll explain in more detail how this happens during sleep, but concept maps also contribute very strongly, very powerfully to long-term memory. So we'll get to those details later. Don't want to jump the gun. One of the items, as you'll notice, is that it's an active learning method. Now, I've sort of described that by referring to the fact that you're doing inspectional reading and that you're making a lot of decisions. So all of these, if you look back at this list, by the time we're done and by the time you're doing concept mapping, you will see the point, every one of these points jump out at you. I make the point that it's a living document. This is what I get from many students, and of course I see it when I use it myself, and that is that a map describes your understanding at the moment. But if you go to class tomorrow and understand more, then by its very nature, if it's more about the same subject, the map on that subject will grow. And so you will find that I'm going to repeat a few things in terms of tips and comments about maps, and that is use or make a lot of room, a lot of what we call white space, because you will find, as many students have told me, you will want to use old maps to save time, of course, and go back and fill them in. All right, now, further, I've pointed out here something that is extremely important for a relatively small proportion of students, but if you're one of those students, it's really important, and that is attention deficit disorder students have a significant problem maintaining time on task. Now, we see students like this all the time, every year in medical school. Students like this are perfectly fine. They're quite functional. In the clinic, they're quite functional. Usually ADD students have developed very good coping skills. And combine that with a very high intelligence, they do just fine in med school. Now, the problem is that the one thing medical school confronts you with is that while the material isn't difficult, there's a lot of it. And there isn't much room to move in terms of time. If you're going to have any kind of life of your own, you're going to have a very good use of time. That means return on investment has to be very high. Okay, so ADD students have a major problem in their use of time, clearly because of the nature of the disorder. And I will let you know how sympathetic I am to this, because I too, I don't know if I'd call it suffer, but I too fit the diagnosis of ADD. So I know from whence I speak. ADD, as you will see, is satisfied by concept mapping because it requires so much activity. The student is never spending very much time at all in any one place. And so it is used even in elementary education for helping students with attention deficit disorder. So I think you're going to find this to be quite helpful if that's a problem of yours. And I further go on one more bullet here, and then we'll be finished with definitions, and that is a visual representation of a student's knowledge. And I kind of alluded to this earlier, but a map itself represents your current understanding, and that's very individual. Stop and think about this. Why do we need 20 textbooks in histology or microbiology or however many there are. But you know and I know that in any course, it can be American history, there are many textbooks on the same subject. Why is that? Because the subject can be represented in many different ways, and all of which are correct. The same is true if you're learning biochemistry from me, because part of my job here when I'm not doing videos like this and teaching about learning is to teach metabolism in biochemistry. And 4 different students can do a map of one of my lectures, and each map can look different, and each map will be correct. So the visual representation is truly an individual one for you. And again, all of these things now that I'm saying now will be amplified as I go through, show you how to map, show you the examples, and you'll begin to see the correlation with the points I'm making early on. So let's move ahead now and talk about one more important concept before we get into what a map looks like and how to map. I've recently introduced into my talks the concept of deliberate practice. Deliberate practice is a state-of-the-art method that has emerged from human performance research that is now being applied in medicine. It is being applied in procedural areas such as surgery, any skill area in medicine, surgical, diagnostic, even visual perceptual skills that you find in radiology are all being or having applications through deliberate practice. And without digressing too much in it, although I've got one more slide to explain it, deliberate practice shuns or rejects the idea that practice makes perfect. Instead, what deliberate practice says is that practice just makes permanent. So if you're not sure you're practicing the right way, all you're doing is making the wrong way permanent. So deliberate practice uses a teacher with the student with high feedback and instruction on basically mistakes, limitations. And they work on that to correct those. If you look at the way professional football players like Jerry Rice developed, if you look at chess masters, if you look at jet pilot training, all the areas where we have talented people emerging and being successful, if you look at their history, they all developed it through deliberate practice. I am now bringing that to learning skills, just as if it was one more clinical skill. And so we're doing this earlier than you would see it, because up till now, deliberate practice was not used or applied until at least the 3rd year in med school, and generally in resident training and post-residency training. So what I want then to illustrate, and the reason deliberate practice applies right now and will apply to concept mapping and learning style, is that it actually reveals not only your strong points, but your limitations. I will be describing a learning cycle later, but suffice it for right now to say that a complete learning cycle is needed for expert diagnostic or clinical reasoning. A complete learning cycle, okay? Now, what is going on with deliberate practice is it's finding the parts of the learning cycle that you don't do well and helps you get those up to par. It helps you balance everything out so that your learning cycles with everything you're learning, and that's everything you're learning in the first 2 years in basic sciences with some clinical skill introduction, and especially in the last 2 years of medical school where you're introduced to patient care and to clinical reasoning. Okay, so We'll be emphasizing deliberate practice more later, but I wanted to introduce the term now so you could understand it. There's also a primer, or not primer, primer. I frequently say that wrong. There is a primer on deliberate practice linked on the home page of the Success Types website, and I invite you to go back and review that again if you haven't already. But that expands quite a bit and explains quite a bit more about it. Now let's get down to business here and look at the anatomy of a concept map. You'll notice in this map, which is a sample map about water, so it's a very generalized subject, and you'll notice that it is a bunch of circles connected with lines. You can call the circles bubbles, as many of my students have. In fact, in the early days, I acquired the nickname Dr. Bubbles. In more recent years, though, I haven't had that come up. But the term that's used in the education literature is nodes. So two nodes connected by a link essentially constitute a sentence. They're a fact. And I'll show this actually in another concept map later when I show you the different levels of concept mapping. So we have a lot of facts connected together, but you notice another aspect of the sample map here, that is that we have nodes that branch. And I have that indicated on the slide. When a node branches, that's essentially in a linear outline, like a sublist under a major topic. Nothing special about it. However, when you're reading, as I said, you're looking for something to put in your map, and where there's a branch point, what you're deciding on is what different concepts can I attach to this one particular node. I want to call your attention to the modifiers or verbs that are actually written on top of the links or the lines between the nodes. These are not always necessary. If you understand the link very clearly, remember the map is just for you. You can show it to other people and talk about it, but in the end, you're going to be studying these maps for exams based on feedback that I get. So if you understand the nature of the link, why waste the time putting something in you don't need to? However, you need to think about this, because many times you not only increase the clarity of that link, but you increase the clarity of your thinking if you put a modifier, which is generally a verb but not always, if you put that into the map. Now, one more link that I want to point out, and then we're going to get down to business about how to build one of these maps. The cross link, and that's indicated in the map. This is a visual representation of the greatest torment of the medical student, at least in the first year and in probably the first 2 years. And in some cases, it persists on into residency where the student is not adapted. The cross-link represents material that isn't always given in lecture. Most of the rest of what I've described up to now is. When I give a lecture in biochemistry, it is my job to organize the material, to delimit it some so the student doesn't have to learn everything, but to show a story and an explanation about how things are related. To a certain extent, I talk about cross-links. So if I talk about carbohydrate metabolism and fat metabolism, I might show similarities between them or differences. In a map, those would be represented by cross-links because they would link together completely separate branches. In one case, a branch on carbohydrates, in another case, the branch on fats. Okay, so what I discovered very early on in working with medical students was, and we'll get to learning style, everything in order It'll be toward the end of the talk, but I'll explain it and illustrate it in more depth. But some of you listening to this, if you've gone through the first 2 steps in this expert skills program, you've already identified that you're a linear learner, and you already will relate to this. And that is linear learners, if they're in an extreme case where they literally do not look around in the material, they only look at one section at a time and read and keep reading further. Students like this do not look for comparisons. They do not look for similarities and differences, and they miss the crosslinks. And guess what the faculty are expecting? The faculty are expecting that you're looking for them. So what do maps contribute? Maps discipline you to look for them. Now, I'll tell you up front, I'll probably repeat this again because it's important to know, especially if you're brand new at this. You need to look for them, but they're not always there. So one caution, kind of ahead of time, where the recommendations and cautions is really at the end, but one caution is when you're building a map and you look for cross-links, don't spin your wheels. The main idea is just to look for them. Believe me, you will get better and better and better at it as you go through different cycles of drawing different maps. Okay, now let's move ahead. One further thing I want to comment on, and I've got examples of this, and then we'll go to concept map construction. Some of the examples I'm going to show you later are built center out. I am going to emphasize actually top-down maps, like the example that I just gave you. The reason for that is that I have learned that the linear learners, known in Myers-Briggs terminology as the sensing types, have a much easier time seeing a top-down map. If you intend to study together with someone by comparing and discussing your maps, why not do it top-down? Because intuitives don't really care which direction it goes in, so why not make it easy for everybody if you happen to be studying with a sensing type? So anyway, enough for that recommendation. Now let's get down to business. In terms of concept map construction, the very first step in concept map construction has nothing to do with a map, with drawing a map. It has to do with what you might call inspectional reading or skimming or scanning. This, surprisingly, is something that many sensing type linear reading students just don't do. They simply start at the beginning and work their way through. That, again, causes you to miss so much. If you go through and begin finding and detailing in a brief list, and this is a fairly short list, much of which, by the way, if you have a lecture outline, is simply nothing more than the major headings in the lecture outline. You don't have to reinvent the wheel, just use what's given to you. But the idea is to try and develop a habit of looking and through and surveying the material so that you are finding what I call the grouping terms, the terms that will include something else. Okay, here's an example. If I say that I'm going to talk about glycolysis, that's a grouping term. What does that glycolysis group under it? It groups a list of enzymes. It groups a list of intermediary metabolites. It actually groups clinical correlations that are significant concerning glycolysis. It also groups interconnections with other pathways. So you see, there are 4 separate subjects that are grouped under glycolysis. Each of those branches out and groups more. But for the moment, when you're starting your map, we're not going to make a list for the whole map at first. We're making only a list to begin the map. That doesn't require very much more than the major headings in a course syllabus. Or if you're doing it out of a textbook, major headings out of a textbook. Okay, so now that you've gotten your list, and that can be any kind of list in any fashion you want to write it. Now what you want to do with that list is go through it and start discriminating and making some decisions. Which are major grouping terms and which of these terms belong under something else? And you see now what the strategy is. What you're deciding on is what goes at the first level and what goes at the next level under that. And I'll explain levels in the examples, but they essentially are the first and second branch points off of the major topic. You can, if you want to go back in your notes and look at the sample map, you can see that water has phases, or states rather, different states. Well, that's a first level. And then states are ice, liquid, and gas. That would be a second level, where the major subject is water. Okay, so what you want to try to achieve in starting your map is to get the first two levels. If you can get the first two levels arrayed out on your page, you can begin by the survey that you're doing to anticipate how much material will go under each and spread them out accordingly. Now, I guess I'm going to have to give you another recommendation here, and that is be patient. You'll get better at this. You can expect to do 2 or maybe even 3 maps of the same subject the first couple of times through. This is not wasted time. Every time you draw anything, the eye-hand feedback helps long-term memory. And again, I'll explain long-term memory more later, but it's the activity that counts. So even at the beginning, when you're doing trial and error and trying to readjust your map, it's useful time. I should tell you this. Many students tell me they can tell you where on a page a certain fact is. They know which corner it's in and what it branches to. And it's only because they drew it and made the decision to draw it. And that's why your time's not wasted. Okay, now, we've come down through 2 steps. We've identified and made a list of all the grouping terms that are general grouping terms. We've now started to identify the ones that will go at the first level and the ones that will go at the second level. Again, I'm going to reiterate this when we go through the examples, so you will hear it again. Now, the third step continues this process and begins to add in modifier verbs and expand and filling out. You're going to probably find that you didn't get everything for that second level down that really was there. You go back and inspect again, and you fill all that in. So by the third step, you are now ready to get into the reading you're used to. Up to now, it's been, especially, again, if you're a sensing type, it's been all different. And I'm going to digress for a moment and talk about the intuitive types. I keep talking about the linear learners and what they're doing wrong, and I don't mean to pick on them, so let's talk about the problems that the intuitive type student has, the big picture type. The problem they have is quite the opposite. They not only look around, they look around too much. They have a hard time staying on task. It takes them forever to get through material. Sensing type students have a strength there in that they're very steady learners and they stay on task a long time. So where you have deficits, you also have strengths for both types. So you intuitive types need to be keeping in mind that while you're doing this listing and deciding, you're staying on task. And that's an advantage for you. Okay, let's get to the next slide that helps us see the last 3 stages. We're now, as I said, beginning to read more like we usually read. That is, looking in depth in each paragraph and really now trying to acquire the understanding that we think is going to be on the exam. But now it's going to be organized on a page in a way that we can get back to it, and on the exam visualize it. As you read in each paragraph, there should be a constant question in your mind, and that is, what goes into my map next? If you're reading a concept, where does this go in the map? If you're looking at the map, what branches under this concept? But it's constantly a matter of looking for. Now I'm going to emphasize something to you about what active learning really is. When you are passively reading, you are sitting looking at the book because you don't know what to look for. You're just looking at everything. You're hoping something will happen if you do it long enough, but nothing generally important really happens. When you're mapping, looking at changes to looking for. When you're looking for something, you are active. And that is very important to long-term memory. And in the future, to diagnostic thinking. I'll explain how as we get into the learning cycle. Okay, now item number 5 asks you to now, at this point, now that you have categorized and branched everything that you have been reading, now start looking for the cross-links. Go back and try and find things that connect together. Sometimes the faculty will give you a clue about this during lecture. And by the way, think about this. Now you have a way of attending lecture differently. The usual student sitting in lecture is hearing. They're listening to what's being said, but they're only hearing it. Like passive reading, there's no decision making being done. It's just coming in. It's either making sense or it's not. Believe me, I can see it from up front. Okay? Now, when you are in lecture and you know that evening you're going to map everything that's been in this lecture, now you're listening for. Just like looking for, you're now listening for something. That's active listening. You're wondering how this will fit. You're making notations. This is a good branch point. You're making notations. Look for cross-links. The point being that you're going to be so much more actively involved in your lectures, it will amaze you. It'll be like study time. It will not be dead time. It will be like actual study time. It will be golden. Okay, item number 6 is really not so much a step in mapping, and I might in the future just make this a footnote instead of a step in mapping, but it's what I referred to earlier, that a spider map or a center out map doesn't matter to the intuitive type because they see things in multiple directions, but and that's their way of perceiving the world. It's not wrong. It's just simply the way they habitually do it. But it's probably a better idea for everyone, again, to do top-down. So I won't beat that to death. Let's go ahead and move on. Now, I would like to start looking at some examples of maps and to show you the various types of maps and how flexible they can be. I encourage you to look at the Success Types book to find more examples, and any of you that have gone through the first step in the pre-matriculation program will have already done this and will have done some of the mapping exercises. Now, the first map that we have here is out of that same article from the Journal of the American Medical Association, and by brief explanation, the goal of the article was to publish the results of an experiment done in the residency program in pediatrics at the University of California at Davis. And the residency program director was trying to determine if he could measure critical thinking skills by the nature of the maps that the students drew. And he developed a scoring system that would take too much time to go into for the purposes here, if you want to look up the map, you can see the reference on the slide, and you can look that up. Or if you want to look up the article, I'm sorry, not the map, the article. But the point being, though, that the article illustrated several different kinds of maps. This first map is called a low-scoring map. By brief explanation, crosslinks were given the highest weight in the scoring, and there are no crosslinks in this map. That's why it's a low-scoring map. But look at what it does show. It really has a lot of strengths for a beginning student who is just trying to get started in mapping. It's got a clear-cut topic, seizures. It's got a clear-cut first level, types of seizures, etiologies, medications. You would easily expect to find these in an article or a text or a chapter in a textbook or in a course syllabus. My guess is these residents, the morning that they did these maps, were probably in a conference on seizures and working off of their notes. But you see, it's very well organized. Even the medications is a nice branch point where it is simply a list of the medications used. But you'll notice no detail, just the medications. Now, this is the map of a first-year resident, and it is what you'd expect from an inexperienced first-year resident. People forget a lot from med school because they're moving through one thing after the other very fast. They're not going to remember all the details, so this student was doing pretty good probably to remember all this. But you see in here how it's, we're looking at the second level, for example, for medications, is just the medications. But look at the types. Look closely here. If you look at the types, which is a first level category, there are only two at the second level, and that is the primary and secondary types. And secondary isn't even listed here. Primary is branched, but secondary isn't. So you've got here in one map different levels of detail already emerging at different levels of the map. That is a correct thing to do. I want to encourage you that maps do not have to be totally symmetrical. They do not have to have equal detail in every branch. The map is only a way of organizing the reading. If the reading happens to emphasize one part of a topic more than another, you will see that in the map. If you're like me and you don't plan ahead well enough, I don't always follow my own advice, by the way, and I'll wind up with a map that has a corner that's overcrowded, and I have to redraw it. So this reflects how topics are covered, and so I want to reassure you as a beginner that a map isn't, again, always totally symmetrical and doesn't always have an equal level of detail in every branch. As long as it reflects correctly the connections, it's correct. Okay, now let's move to the next map. Now this is a dramatic change. Same article, but now a third-year resident. Now, let's think about what's different about that resident. Not only is this the third time they've heard the lecture on seizures, this is a resident that's treated seizure patients. Their map isn't at all standard. Or this particular resident's map isn't at all standard. It doesn't have, compare the first level. It doesn't have anything like the first level in the simplified map. That's okay. What has happened is that the student's thinking has evolved. Remember, maps are living documents. They change with your understanding. What you are seeing in this map is the growth of a third-year resident's understanding from their first year. Okay, look at the crosslinks. It's loaded. That's why it's a high-scoring map. Crosslinks are the hardest things to find, and they represent deeper understanding. The deeper you understand a subject, the more crosslinks you will be able to construct. That's something you have to take my word for, but trust me, if you get through this, if you stick with it, and make it work, especially those of you that are still in your coursework in pre-med, now is the time to get going on this and use it while you got spare time in your schedule that won't exist in med school. But you're going to find that your understanding continues to evolve and develop, and your maps will continue to evolve. Okay, I think that those are the major points for comparing those two sample maps. They illustrate many of the major topics of map construction. Now I'd like to move through a series of maps. Again, if you've done the first stage or phase of the Expert Skills program and you've been through the Success Types book, then you'll recognize this. This is the sequence of slides that illustrates how to do rotator cuff. Now I bring this out here to show you that if space is limiting, if you simply make your personal choice to make your maps only on a standard size sheet of paper. See, this was my limitation in writing the Success Types book. There's no way I could put my maps on a poster pad, which is the choice of many students. So I had to show expansion bubbles. Now, if you'll look here at the bottom right, you'll see the bubble that shows the axilla, pectoral region, and shoulder expanded. Now, if we go to the next slide and think of that bubble or node, we find, and I've starred, by the way, routinely on each page, I would star the major topic. And so you see it appear again, axilla, pectoral region, and shoulder, and more branches now. If you go back and compare with the previous slide, there were no branches. Now we've got branches, but again, very general, very easy to find too. All right, now, if we keep going, and we keep, and by the way, this is just exactly like Google Earth. What happens if you back all the way out till you see the whole Earth? What's the first thing you zoom in on? A continent. But the outline of countries takes shape. You zoom in on a country and what happens? The outline of the states takes shape. Zoom in on a state and so forth until you're zooming in on your home on the street that you live. So this is essentially what concept maps help you do, is you sort everything out and you're able, in looking over a concept map, to selectively zoom in on anything you've included in the map later on when you're studying. Okay, so back to our sequence now in the slides. So now we have isolated in the next slide muscles as the main topic. Now you realize we've selected muscles, but if you go back and inspect the previous slide, you'll notice lymphatics and breast were also categories. So where we have muscles here in the center as the major topic, you can have two other pages with the major headings breast and the major heading lymphatics. And so you're going to wind up with quite a few pages, aren't you? But on the other hand, the pages can be grouped so they can be one after the other in logical order, and the subject can still unfold in a way that doesn't make you dizzy every time you look at it. Because I guarantee you, students have told me this, that when there's too much on one page, and in fact, in some of the talks that I do around the country, they will tell me in some slides that are very busy that it blew all their circuits because they didn't know where to look or what to get out of it. So anyway, this is again an emphasis. At first anyway, try to keep your maps simple as you develop them, and use your own discretion as to how complicated you want them to get as you gain experience. Now, moving again to muscles, what have we done here? Well, we've branched off rotator cuff, which is in fact what we're after. So you notice the expansion bubble extending out from rotator cuff. That means the next page is going to have at its center the rotator cuff. So let's look at that, and that's just what we have. Now you'll notice that you're beginning to see the kind of detail that you expect to find on the exam. Now we're getting to the stuff they test on. Not that the other stuff doesn't fit in, but the stuff you're worried about that you want to remember are those new concepts, the new terms, basically the new foreign language is what most students consider anatomy to be. It's not only a science, but it's a foreign language as well. So the rotator cuff then begins branching into different things, functions and associated bursae, but what we want to look at are the muscles for the purpose of this concept map. So if we go to the next slide, we find isolating just one of those muscles now gets us to the final level of detail. This is all you need to learn about rotator cuff. If you extend each of the previous bubbles to its full extension like this, you will have the full set of information you need for test questions on rotator cuff. So that's what a map will do for you. You notice that I'm not making any emphasis that this substitutes for laboratory in anatomy. A laboratory work teaches you different aspects of anatomy. There are other ways of thinking about anatomy that are only learned hands-on. What mapping does is help you with vocabulary, organizing the terminology, organizing all of these structures into something that you can remember for the exam. Not just remember, exams in anatomy require more than remembering. They require you to make decisions and come to conclusions. So you need the terms just as a vocabulary to think with. And the same is true, by the way, in every basic science course. You're going to be adding up terminology, which will go in a map. You're going to be organizing the terminology, which will help you think with it. Okay, now, let us move through a couple more, maybe a little more quickly, because we've kind of made some major points with rotator cuff. But when we look at brachial plexus, even though it's just a few slides here, it shows another major difficult area for students that can be simplified or at least made approachable by breaking it out into a map. When you compare this with just sitting and reading, it's unbelievable how it enhances your understanding. I have gotten feedback from surgical residents, from faculty, and from undergrad students, almost in the same words. And it's in the form generally of a question. Why is it when I look at my maps, I understand the material, but when I look at it in a book, I can't make any sense out of it? And the reason is actually not that hard to understand when you see what's going on. The book has just got too many words. Now, when do you need those words? When you're making a map. You need those words when you're making sense out of it, because they tell a story. I've written some books myself. I understand the process. For me to communicate as an author, I've got to write sentences and paragraphs. But students don't have to remember full sentences. Students don't have to memorize full paragraphs. Okay? So what we're doing is condensing into the concept maps the material that is going to be on the test likely, but in a fashion that you can see it. And visually, you don't have to read all the words because you've already done that. Okay, I don't want to beat that to death either, but there are certain points here that are worth driving home from experience, with students. Now, so we've looked at the brachial plexus and seen that it branches out into components and general features. Let's look at the components in the next slide. And we find that, again, we have a variety of components, and particularly the chords, which we're after. Now, I want to explain one thing, by the way. about this map and where it came from. These maps were drawn by Dr. Bernell Daly, my co-author for the Success Types book, and they were done when he was course director for gross anatomy. I asked him to pick out for the book the 2 hardest things that the medical students encounter in their first weeks of medical school. My reasoning was that the book was going to be used primarily by entering medical students. So this is why you're seeing the rotator cuff and brachial plexus. And these are Dr. Daly's maps of his view of what the student should be emphasizing. So now, with that digression aside, let me move back into the maps. So now you'll see that we want to do a Google map again, a zoom in on chords. And when we do that in the next slide, we find all of the material, again, that's going to be on the test. So another series of slides that have shown zooming in on the material that's going to be on the exam, and you notice there is never a concern, never a worry about whether you're going to miss something. Now, students worry about this. They think that drawing this map, they're going to forget to put something in it. If anything, you're going to see more than you do with just linear reading. And you'll see it better. Okay, now, this next map is very interesting to me because historically, I was given this map by a very enthusiastic microbiology professor at a school I was visiting where I was talking with their students. And he had already learned about mapping and had attended my lecture because he had seen it advertised and was so enthused with mapping he wanted to come and talk with me about it, which he did afterward. And he has allowed me to use this map of his in his teaching. Now, I think it's very instructive here. If you will notice the top-down nature of the map with no cross-links, this professor is a sensing type. And he got the greatest enjoyment out of learning about his own learning style and teaching style, and learning that his map was the way it was because of the way he learned. So I would like for each of you to take away from that little anecdote that this isn't just about pre-meds and first-year medical students. This is about everyone up through practicing physicians. Okay, so let me move now to an illustration in the next series of maps of some points about maps and about reading style. If you'll look at this, what we call recall level maps, recall means memorization. What do you recall from your learning? It's the simplest, lowest level of learning, not to imply unimportant. A surgical procedure is also something you recall. And I think you're going to consider, if the surgeon's inside your chest, that he recall it in exactly the order he did for the other patients, okay? So the value of these levels is not at issue. What we want to talk about is what is going to be asked of you in total as a physician. Recall is part of that. Especially, as I said, if you go into a procedural area like surgery, another area, primary care, uses recall a lot, but simple patient data that are collected during well-patient checkups primarily. So anyway, each practice, or specialty practice rather, in medicine has its own use for these different levels. Now, getting back to this slide, if you look left to right, you see 3 separate facts. This is a visual demonstration of the way a linear learner is learning. Everything from a major heading to a fine detail is just like this map right here. Nothing's connected. Everything is learned as a separate fact. I'm amazed at how powerful some students are at this. It gets them into med school. But one of the things you got to understand, in pre-med you've got drop add. In pre-med you can take, some of you take a pretty heavy course load. To your credit, because it gives you the rigor that you're going to experience in med school. Others that work or just simply can't register for the courses take lighter loads. The point being flexibility. In med school, that extra time for memorizing vanishes. You find yourself on the weekend, instead of going back and memorizing, catching up. Not that you plan to, but that's just how fast it moves. Students tell me over and over each year when I'm trying to work with them that they say, this is like trying to fix a tire on a moving car. You know, nobody stops. It's like boot camp, really, where you're marching with the rest of the class. Okay, this is not, by the way, to paint a horrible picture. Med school can, in fact, be a very stimulating experience, but you got to be ready for it. So this is the purpose of this video. It's to get you ready to have fun in med school. Okay, now, let's look at the next level and see what's different about just simply one level up. This is called, in a learning taxonomy, the analysis level, because analysis tends, if you're looking at a subject area, to break things down into their groups. What have I been using up to now? The word grouping terms. So you see in this map, the major heading, diabetes mellitus, is a grouping term, but under that, one of the major topic or levels is type 1 versus type 2. And that in turn branches. So that's a grouping term. And what this shows is that now the facts, which might have been completely separate from each other, are now being attached to each other, and suddenly the subject is beginning to acquire meaning. When the subject acquires meaning, you acquire understanding. Now it gets better. Let's look at the next level. Do you remember I told you that comparisons are a visual representation of the torment of the first and second year student? The hardest test questions, reproducibly, the hardest test questions are the ones that ask for comparisons. They're not hard because they're complex. They're not hard because they're hard to learn. They're hard because they're hard to find. That if you don't have the time in your study, if it's not efficient, if it's not effective, you're going to miss some of them. And then that's going to leave you on a test guessing. Okay, or relying totally on memorization. Okay, so I have done a survey with some colleagues of mine on both anatomy and biochemistry tests, and we have counted up the proportion of questions that require memorization and those that require higher order thinking or comparisons. Fully 1/3 of both anatomy and biochemistry are comparison higher order questions. So if you're under the impression anatomy is all about memorization, you've now had a wake-up call. So all of these principles apply pretty much equally across all subjects. The subjects are different, the nature of the learning is the same. Now, in this map, the comparison level map, I haven't fully filled this out. I only filled out one example that cross-links two major branches to make the point. The idea here is that any number of other nodes could be attached to any of these nodes, and any number of linkers could be put in, depending on what you're learning. For diabetes, you'll learn simple things at first, when by the time you get to the third year in internal medicine and pediatrics, you'll be learning much more in depth. So your maps will look different then. So the comparisons, again, they're harder to find than anything else. That's because the learning is one step deeper in terms of complexity, but it will definitely, absolutely prepare you better for exams. And for that 1/3 of the test that requires decision making, that isn't memorized. Now, let me recap very quickly what we've done. And I'm doing this for a purpose. I realize you could recap for yourself. You could just go back and look. But I've tried to make this into almost like a marketing jingle that you can remember when you're sitting alone studying. List, group, and compare. List, group, and compare. The first thing you do is make a list. And then from that list you start grouping, and that grouping then is transferred to a map. And as that map is filled out and grouping is completed, you then start comparing. List, group, and compare. That's a checklist. If you haven't done the comparisons, you're leaving out an important step. Okay. Now, I'm going to just leave that. I've made the point that I want to make with that. I'm going to leave that slide as it is. And now I want to mention to you, because it is always asked about computer programs. And the one program that works the best, it turns out to be a free program. And the details are on the handout notes. But I think you'll like CMAP tools. And the next slide, I'll quickly show you what a screenshot looks like of that. But basically, it's easy to use because it's easy to type the terms into the fields, but you can move the nodes and the links follow. So you can basically, it's just like working on a magnetic board. You can move things around, and that all works very well. Now, having told you that, I really want to emphasize your first map, you really need to try doing it with your hand on a sheet of paper. Some people use a whiteboard. Many students are now buying 2x3 whiteboards, hanging them on their apartment wall. And what they do actually is kind of clever. They use stick-it notes, post-it notes for the nodes. And so all they're doing is drawing links. And that way they can move and erase until they get their beginning map the way they want it. Then they sit down and copy it by hand and record it on their page. Some people are just faster with computer programs than others. But you need to always ask yourself. Now, as a pre-med, if you're doing this before getting to med school, you won't see this as much. And that's okay. You can do what you want in pre-med. But you need to evaluate carefully how you're using your time and whether recording in a computer programming is paying off. A computer program, rather. Whether a computer program is paying off. Okay? So just think about it. I was recently introduced on a trip I just took to another medical school, introduced to an iPad application, and actually there were two of them that I found. The one that is called iThoughts HD looks to me very much like CMAP tools. It's so recent for me, I haven't had time really to do anything more than download it and just look at the general features. So I don't know that to recommend it, but for those of you that want to try it on the iPad, that may be the tool for you. The future is so hard to predict anymore. Now let's just take a quick look. This is the CMAP tools appearance on your computer screen. It has a couple of accessory windows. It probably has far more than you will ever use. It's set up to go on the web and share maps. And so just, again, use your best judgment as to how much you need to map on the computer. Okay, having gotten through that, let's talk quickly now about learning style differences. Much of this was covered in both of the first two phases of the Expert Skills program. And so it will be review for some, but I'm trying to do this video for people who may be picking it up as their first element and want to do it first. What we find in mapping is that sensing type students who are linear learners find that when they have to break things out into a map, it causes them to read differently. And this is the comment that I get. They believe after a while that they read better, that they understand more and they remember more. However, this is not true at first. Sensing type students at first have one major concern. Is my map correct? That's a part of their personality type, and frankly, it's a valuable part. It makes them highly responsible students, wanting things to be done right. I'm not about to discourage that. What I try to show them, though, and I'd like you to understand, again, I'm repeating now, one map can be correct and not look like another one, which is also correct. So you can find this out yourself, even without a teacher, if you can get a study partner and you both do the map separately first and then get together and show each other your maps, you can both look at them and talk about them. Okay? And that'll help both of you learn basically to look around, to inspect better, and to look for those comparisons, especially if that other partner is an intuitive type. Now, what the sensing type will bring to the intuitive type in a study pair, sensing type will remember all the details that the intuitive type will forget to put in their map. Everybody has their blind spot, and it shows up at different points in time. So working together, you become better. You become more. Both types of thinking blend. Both students walk away knowing more than if they had studied alone. Now, I also want to talk about, again, to expand a little on the intuitive type. They report to me a much longer time on task and also better memory for details. You see, an intuitive type, by their very nature, looking for a big picture, will become satisfied once they have the big picture and they get bored with the details. And what happens when you get bored with something? You're fighting off paying attention, aren't you? Same thing is true in lecture, okay? If you got somebody who's just reading slides to you, what happens? You get bored, you start daydreaming, shopping on eBay, the whole thing, all right? So what you find is for the intuitive types then, by going back and forth, before they even realize it, they're incorporating detail that they would have been bored with had they just been reading. Just reading, they'll see the big picture, and then the rest of it, they'll overlook. They won't remember the details. And those are the questions they miss on the exam. They get the hardest questions right and miss the memorization. Because for them, those are the hardest questions. Okay, enough said, but I think that you can see that both types benefit from mapping, but they benefit for different reasons. Now let me move ahead to the next slide, and kind of which illustrates and drives home the way students with different learning styles see material, new material. The linear learner links one after the other, and this is the way they read. When they learn to map, they shift into a reading pattern that the integrative learner uses, and you see it on the right. That integrative learner is linking everything together as it comes to them and as they look around and find it. They're constantly skipping around. Basically, they are subclinical ADD. They just haven't been diagnosed yet, okay? But they're not impaired by it. Now, when I use ADD as a diagnosis, I'm thinking of the development of this situation in a person's thinking to the point that they're impaired. When you're impaired, you get clinical help. But many people walk around distracted and easily distracted, but it's not impairing them. So it's anybody's guess as to what's really clinical or not. But many of you who are intuitive types know that you feel ADD symptoms because you're just jumping all over the place. Well, again, mapping will, because of that jumping around, that will help you fill in a map. And if you're asking the question, where does this go, it disciplines you and it makes you use your time better. Now, let's look at this learning cycle thing. We're going to look at it again fairly quickly here because it's explained in more depth in the neurobiology of learning video that also accompanies this series. Essentially here we have a view of the major functional areas of the brain. You'll see in the back of the brain the sensory area. We're not going to get into the terminology except for the temporal area, which is essentially the brain's hard drive. It's the area of the brain that processes long-term memory. It's the area of the brain that's used first in the learning cycle. It's the area of the brain that I believe sensing types prefer to use. Perhaps because biologically for them, genetically through their inheritance, it's the easiest branch or part of the brain to use. There are theories of intelligence that do say or propose that our different intelligences are based on the way we use our brain, and that the areas we use easiest are the areas that naturally develop the most and hence give us a certain intelligence. So anyway, getting back to the sensing types, the temporal area of the brain looks first at information coming in. The information, for example, I'm giving you now, the information I might teach you if you come to Texas Tech, the information that would be in one of my biochemistry lectures. And the temporal area of your brain asks or tries to recognize if it knows that material, if it's seen it before. If it doesn't, then the front of your brain takes over and starts asking some questions about it. Now here's where deliberate practice comes in. Because getting back to the sensing type, if they're using the temporal area, they're giving time up to some other area. And guess what that is? The prefrontal area. Now the prefrontal area is not just asking questions. It's just not just asking, well, how can I, what big picture will help me remember this material? How might I draw a concept map of this material? The front of the brain's also making decisions. Remember, that was a major point I made in that second video on neurobiology, that the front of the brain is essentially the part of your brain that takes tests. Not the back of your brain. The front of your brain uses the back of your brain. Okay? That's a big difference. The front of your brain uses the material in the back of your brain, puts it together, makes decisions about what's the right answer, and in many cases what answers are wrong, and then check marks or enters on the computer screen the answer choice. So now you see, as we flow through the brain, information is either recognized or it's not, and then the brain asks, what does it mean? And then for the final step, the brain acts on that. The brain makes a decision and then does something. If you're taking a test, it check marks the answer. But if you're studying, what is your brain doing? Okay, now if you're sitting and reading, your brain's not doing anything but looking. If you're concept mapping, the brain's deciding what link to draw next, and then motor output draws the link. If you will say it, even if you're an introvert, doesn't matter if you're the quiet type. You might now want to do this in a coffee shop. You maybe be alone. But as you draw the links, say them as you draw them. Like you're speaking to a friend. I think this goes here because. The sensory feedback plus the active process, the area of your brain that speaks, it's called Broca's area, is also frontal. It's a motor area, but it integrates your knowledge. If you're going to say something sensible, your brain has to work to do that. Okay, to put the things, you're not going to get away recognizing something. Now, what happens? I'm going to lecture you a little bit on sitting and reading. What happens if you sit and read? Because I'm doing this because I see it a lot. Students hole up under time pressure and sit and look at the book, and they think they're doing the right thing. And what they're doing is wasting their time, literally, because they're getting no return on their investment in long-term memory or decision making. Okay, now, when you are making decisions, when you are evaluating something, and then you're trying to assess whether you know it, you might look at it and it looks familiar, so you think you know it. That's not the test. That just shows you recognize it. Doesn't show you can think with it. You must be able to say it. And you must be able to say it intelligently. Now, if you think I'm just talking about tests in anatomy and biochemistry, I'm talking also about what attendings expect. Attending physicians in the third year do not care if you know the right diagnosis. What they care about is whether you know why. They're going to expect explanations from you. They want explanations for everything you say to them. That is not hard to do, and if you do concept mapping, you're going to look forward to it because it'll be fun. You'll find yourself in a friendly dialogue with the attending. Otherwise, you're going to find yourself struggling because recognizing things proves nothing. Okay, now, so you've seen the learning cycle, and now you see what deliberate practice means here. If you're an intuitive type, where's your limitation? Well, where are you spending most of your time? Probably the front of your brain. What do intuitives do? They ask what something means. That's what the front of the brain does. So intuitives tend to spend their thinking time in the front of the brain. What are they neglecting? Fact memory. That's why they're weak on facts. You introduce them to a friend at a party and they'll forget their name right away. That's how bad it can be with intuitive types. So, intuitives need to use deliberate practice with concept mapping to build fact memory. Sensing types need to use deliberate practice with concept mapping to find big picture patterns and crosslinks. You see? Beautiful. Both types doing both are on their way to being expert learners instead of just minimum adequate. Okay, now the same will hold for motor output in surgical practice, intubation and anesthesiology, you name it, auscultation with a stethoscope, you name any procedure that you do in medical training, you apply deliberate practice to motor skills. Okay. So that will come through later. And even perceptual skills in terms of radiography, and again, even reading body language and taking a history. So all elements of the learning cycle are addressed in medical school, and you need to appreciate right now that if you expect to become the expert others want you to be, and perhaps you want to be too, you've got to be thinking deliberate practice is your standard of excellence. Okay, let me move now we're getting near the end, but I want to, actually without realizing it, have covered several slides ahead. I want to move here to the barriers to utilization and talk to you about things that I've encountered through my experience. Now, I think the major barrier is one of time, and it's ironic that if you talk to students who have taken the risk, spent the time, and actually gotten good, and I'm talking now sensing type students for whom this is the hardest, but once they get used to doing this and get faster at it, they will tell you to your face they would never go back to the way they used to learn. And the reason is they don't have time. The very thing that prevents most students from even trying it is the thing that keeps the experienced student addicted to it. And I think it's all a matter of timing. That is why We're trying to reach you before you show up at medical school. We want to catch you at the earliest possible moment and give you something to do with your time that really counts. Speed reading isn't going to help you. Buying Grey's Anatomy isn't going to help you. But this deliberate practice with concept mapping will. Now, I've gone through the idea of learning style, and I'll just make the point again briefly that intuitives tend to think they don't need to do maps because they already see them in the way they study. But what they find is, number one, I've told you, time on task goes up. Big return on investment. Remember, the investment is time. What are you getting for your time? Okay. The other thing intuitives learn is, while they do see patterns, and they do see them quicker, they don't see them all. And as they're doing a map, they discover others. So they just get better at what they're already good at. Sensing types, actually sensing types are the reason I got into this to begin with. I was trying to find a way to help the students who were failing their early exams. Sensing types don't show their knowledge on exams as well as intuitives. They're just as smart, they just don't learn the same way. So I learned and made the guess that concept mapping would help sensing types see the patterns that the intuitive types were seeing, and it would bring their grades up. And it does. One thing, I've got a comment in here about energy in this slide. That energy is not energy like you would expend on the tennis court. This is energy that you expend mentally. But you will find a sense of fatigue. You are not going to be able to concept map all night. And you will need to pace yourself and take breaks. Just divert your attention with whatever is a good diversion, and then get back to it. Decision making is very demanding. Mapping is a constant series of decisions. Okay, so take that advice. You'll get used to it. I'll share with you a humorous email that I got from a student at Dartmouth who was, I was advising online, and I warned her about getting tired, and so she wrote back to me in one email. The email was good news that the mapping had helped her pass a test that she had failed during the school year and making it up over the summer. So that was fun to hear. And then she ended the email, oh, by the way, you were right. I mapped for 2 hours and then I napped for 2 hours. So that kind of drives the point home and shows you how it affected her. Now, let's get close to winding up here with the recommendations and cautions, some of which I've already given you. I want you to understand very clearly that the magic here, the magic in a map, is in constructing the map, not in the map itself. If you were to get some other student's map, because it really looks good, it really looks complete, it's a nice visual organization, much simpler than the book, all you're getting is someone else's thinking. You may as well read the book. See, the magic is in the decision making that builds the map. Okay, got that? Now, once you are done with that, you should then feel free to discuss your map with anyone else having done the same map. Because now your thinking has been displayed. Remember, it's a visual organization of your individual thinking. Now you can get a lot out of comparing your thinking with someone else's. No two students, I've seen this in many volunteer groups that I mentor, no two students see things exactly alike. They hear things in lecture differently. It's amazing. Every faculty member thinks every student's getting the same thing. Not true. they get very different things from this very same lecture. Okay, so when students get together, they discover things they missed, things they just misunderstood, and by putting these together, I've had volunteer groups that have done nothing but, on a weekly basis, putting their maps together on the same topic. It was agreed upon in advance. They would cover this topic, and this topic for about an hour and a half. All they would do is put their maps on the board and discuss them. Why they put this here, why they subdivided this here. And by the end of the discussion, everybody had a good understanding of that topic. Fascinating. What a way to organize discussion. This is the way to study in groups. Don't get to, I know it's another subject, but don't get together in groups and go back over the material. You'll just bore each other to death and you'll break up anyway. I've seen it happen year after year. I want to also point out that things that I have not, that students use a variety of indicators or systems in their mapping. Some will use colors to color code. Thinking types, for example, might use colors to color code because thinking types emphasize logic. What do feeling types emphasize? Quality. So they will put color in a map to literally make it pretty. If you think that's frivolous, if you're a thinking type, think about this. You can't remember anything that you don't care about. And when you're asleep, what your brain cares about goes into long-term memory, and what it doesn't care about is forgotten. It's literally pruned out. So the feeling types are actually, in a sense, making good sense. Okay, but engineering students who have had a computer background will bring in different shape nodes to emphasize different processes. So students use a whole wide variety of their own coding systems within a map. Maps can become very highly individual, but they're built by the same general process. Okay, I've made the point of, I'm going to move ahead again to the next slide, and I've made the point that maps are living documents. I think I've made that fairly well. One of the things I might mention, though, about living documents, you might find in physiology that you want to use your anatomy of the heart map when you're doing cardiovascular physiology. So you'll find that maps will cause you to begin blurring the boundaries between courses. And this is just something, again, that's an individual decision. You discover that on your own. Students that map, and that map at the level of skill fast, only use their maps to study for tests. They never look at their notes again. Now, a lot of you can't imagine getting ready for a test and not going over the notes. But you got to remember, these students have not only made their map, but on the weekend, if you will study that chapter in Success Types on Time Management, it emphasizes on the weekend you pull it all together and refine your maps. Once you've gone back and made sense out of every map, you really don't need the notes again. And study, this is every student tells you. And if they were giving you advice themselves, I've heard them do it literally. It's a lot of time up front making the maps, but the payoff is studying for the exams because it goes like that. It's easy, organized, and fast, and with confidence. And these people make A's. Literally, their grades go up into the A level. Okay. One student, I should tell you, one of my really better success stories. As a student who was accepted into medical school with a 28 MCAT, which is not bad, but it's average. His score on step 1 that he attributes personally to switching to concept mapping on step 1, 258. That isn't perfect, by the way. 260 is perfect. Okay. Oh, by the way, he made it 260 on step 2. Okay. It was important to him for me to tell you that. He has stayed in touch through email up through his residency fellowship because he felt so strongly on the effect on him that he wanted to give his story for me to pass on to you. Okay. I believe I have made most of the recommendations now for you. And so now I want to go back to the goals that I went over. I showed you the different points I wanted to cover. Let's look at what we've covered. We looked at what a map is and gave several definitions. And I think you've seen that all the way through this session, that they're a linear, or not linear, but they're a visual organization, they're living documents, they're good for time on task, especially for ADD students, and so forth. We then went into looking at the anatomy of a map. We talked about how it's a hierarchical structure, and yet within that hierarchy, you can begin to see, if you look for them, crosslinks and interconnections, and how important those are in higher order thinking, and later on in clinical decision making. We talked about the construction of a map and how the steps are involved, systematically building, essentially likening it to Google Earth, where you zoom in. Instead of starting at the state level, you start at the continent level, and you zoom down to the state level, okay? And one thing I realize that I have mentioned throughout, and like I told you, I've done this so many times, so many ways, I sometimes forget what I actually have in the slide set and what I don't. I've mentioned sleep a number of times and not really had a slide on it. So I'll very quickly tell you, this is covered in the neurobiology of learning, but essentially your brain rehearses during deep sleep everything you've done the day before. Each REM cycle is a rehearsal, and the research studies have shown that your brain actually literally goes back through what you did. And each time it goes through, it prunes out the stuff it decides you don't need to remember. It decides that emotionally. Maps are emotional because they give a sense of satisfaction and control by visually seeing what you have done with the material. When you finish reading a chapter, you have nothing more than a memory of the time you've spent. The next morning, it's very unlikely you remember much of anything. Okay? You usually remember after 2 or 3 times through the material. Many students will tell you 2 times through the material is a luxury. Okay. We've gone through then, so that enough for sleep. I did mention it, and if you want to know more about sleep, I say more about that in the neurobiology of learning video. The concept mapping examples help to illustrate a number of points. Then I talked about barriers, the main one being time, which is why we're doing this video, so a lot of students can get into this before they get under pressure in med school. And then finally, recommendations and cautions that I have learned from experience. I want to end the videotape with an encouragement to you to give this a try, even if it seems like something that you might not enjoy. One of the things that I know you won't enjoy is the feeling you get when an exam comes back with a low grade. And that just doesn't happen to people that map. So hopefully this has been a starter for you, and that you will continue to use the Success Types book, work with friends, work with study partners, and try and make mapping a tool to help you develop your learning skills.